Alright, what's going on everyone? Okay, this video is going to be a risky one. This is going to be a touchy one. This is going to be one that's, some people might get offended. I feel like we just need to talk about this, but it is a topic that, people tend to be a little bit emotional about. Because today we're talking about whether or not Magic the Gathering is pay to win. And this is something that incites a lot of passion in people. People get super offended about. And it makes sense, we all love Magic the Gathering. And pay to win is a very negative term applied to a lot of really terrible games, so people get defensive. It makes sense. So let me start this video by saying that I've been playing this game for 17 years. As of the recording of this video, I learned to play in 2002-ish. I played around the time that Odyssey and Onslaught were in Standard, and I've loved it all this time. It's a great game. It's been a great game for 17 years, but just because I like the game doesn't necessarily mean it's not pay to win. And maybe if we could come to terms with the reality of this situation, maybe we can be more sympathetic towards people who maybe can't afford to pay for an actual good deck, and maybe we'll have more people interested in the importance of reprints and whatnot. So it's gonna be tough, but we have to talk about this. So before we begin, let's first define what pay to win is. Now, there isn't a clear definition, as people have different opinions as to where the cutoff is for the pay to win term, but generally speaking, it's a game in which paying money results in a competitive advantage over those who don't pay the money. Basically, if you give the game developer money, you will have some sort of a power up or something that makes you better equipped to beat other people. Now the question is, does that apply to Magic? Does paying money result in more wins? And the simple answer is yeah, it does. Now wait, before you get angry, before you dislike this video, before you go away, let me be crystal clear about this. Competitive Magic is one of the most skill intensive games you can play, and Magic being paid to win doesn't undermine the accomplishments of professional Magic the Gathering players. If I say that Magic is paid to win, I am not saying that competitive players aren't incredibly talented individuals. And I'm not saying that they don't win based on their skill, because they do. Just because a game is paid to win doesn't mean that it doesn't take skill to win at the competitive level. And I will go deeper as to why that is a little later in the video. I also want you to understand that I myself play tier 1 decks. I have tier 1 affinity in paper, so I have a pay to win deck. I'm not making this video because I'm an angry casual player. I have paid the money. I have gotten over the paywall. I have a tier 1, even though, okay, fair enough, affinity isn't really a tier 1 deck at the moment in modern, but whatever. So anyway, the point is, I'm not an angry casual player. I am speaking as someone who has climbed over the paywall. So one of the most common arguments against Magic being pay to win is that Magic isn't pay to win, it's pay to not lose. This kind of triggers me. It's such utter nonsense. If you're paying to not lose in a 2-player game, that means you're winning. This argument is completely preposterous. I mean, we don't even really need to spend much time on this because it's a completely ridiculous thing to say. Paying to not lose in a 2-player game means that you're paying to win. If you're not losing in a 2-player game, then you're winning. So if you paid to not lose the game, that means you won because you paid. We can just move on. Stupid argument. A similar argument you will see people make is that Magic isn't pay to win, it's pay to be competitive. This falls under the same category as the last argument. If you aren't competitive because you haven't paid, then that's pay to win. This is just an alternate term used by people who don't want to sort of face the realities of the term, right? Like they don't want to say pay to win because that's a scary, bad, evil term. So pay to be competitive is kind of a feel-good term, but it means the same thing. And the next argument people will frequently use is, excuse me, I just bought this tier 1 deck and I went to a GP with it and I lost a whole bunch, so obviously it's not pay to win, lol. So the problem with this argument is that this is also true for pay to win games. Remember that pay to win gives you a competitive advantage over those who don't pay. However, when 2 pay to win players get matched up, that pay to win advantage gets nullified. Let's say you're playing like an RPG or like any kind of fighting game, and there's a pay to win advantage where you get plus 10 strength and plus 10 defense. Well, if you buy that and you play against someone who doesn't have it, then you just win. Basically, like 90% of the time you'll win, unless you're just completely incompetent and the other person is just completely amazing that they can actually overcome that advantage. And yeah, it's possible, but generally speaking, you're gonna win. However, if you get matched up against someone else who also paid for the plus 10 strength and plus 10 defense, then there's no advantage at all. And that's why pay to win games try to match people who have paid against people who haven't. That way the people who paid feel like they're being rewarded for the money they put in, and the people who haven't will feel encouraged encouraged to spend more. If someone spends money on a pay-to-win game and then they get matched up against another pay-to-win player, then the pay-to-win advantage balances itself out and it becomes a skill-based competition again. So yes, paying money in a pay-to-win game won't make you the reigning world champion of that game. It just means that you will always win against people who haven't paid, just like in Magic the Gathering. And this, by the way, is why admitting that Magic is pay-to-win doesn't diminish the accomplishments of competitive players. Tier 1 competitive decks will absolutely destroy casual decks. There's no doubt about that. Anyone who disagrees is just being disagreeable, but since everyone at the professional level is playing competitive decks, the pay-to-win advantage is nullified and it's a pure skill-based competition where the best Magic players win. So yes, you can buy a tier 1 deck and you will lose. You're not going to win a GP, you're not going to be the world champion of Magic just by buying a tier 1 deck. You cannot pay to win a world championship, but that's not what pay-to-win games are. Pay-to-win means you pay to beat those who haven't paid. So for example, Reed Duke's accomplishments aren't diminished by the fact that Magic is paid to win, because when he goes to a world championship or an MPL, whatever, when a big tournament, he's playing against other skilled players with tier 1 decks. So it doesn't matter. He wins because, he's a fantastic Magic player, one of the best in the world, along with all the other professional players, and they're just better than everyone else, and that's fine. But that doesn't change the fact that if you take an average person off the street and give them $1,000 deck, and then take another person and give them a $15 deck, that the match is even. It's not. No, in no way is that remotely, comparable. The person with the $1,000 deck is pretty much always going to win, guaranteed. Now, some people like to say that a tier 1 deck can be beaten by a casual deck if it's a really good matchup, such as like a janky combo deck beating a tier 1 deck with no interaction, or a casual aggro deck beating a slow control deck. And people also say that if you give Reed Duke, I don't know why I'm using Reed Duke, sorry Reed Duke, apologies, you're a nice dude, maybe you won't be angry for me using you as an example, but people will say that if you give Reed Duke a casual deck and a casual player a tier 1 deck, that Reed Duke could probably win. And both of these things are true, but that's because you can manipulate the circumstance to get like the perfect scenario to make the pay to win deck lose to a budget deck. That doesn't mean you've disproven that the game is pay to win. For example, let's say we're talking about like a first person shooter game, right? Let's say there's a pay to win advantage where like your guns are more powerful or they shoot faster, whatever. Let's say you give that pay to win account to someone who is completely incompetent at first person shooters, and then you give the professional gamer a free to play account with no bonuses. The professional gamer will still probably win. So yes, by that logic, pay to win games don't exist at all. But remember that pay to win means you have a competitive advantage over those who haven't paid. So if you take two players of equal skill and one player can pay for the competitive advantage to tip the scales, then that makes it a pay to win game. So for example, the shooting game, if you take two players who have like a 50% win rate against each other, they're perfectly matched, but then the other one can pay $10 for all kinds of bonuses, and then they start winning 95% of the time, that's pay to win. And that's absolutely true for Magic as well. Obviously you can manipulate the circumstance so that, the pay to win player loses, but realistically at an average Friday Night Magic or whatever, the pay to win players will beat the people who aren't paying. I guarantee you that if you give Reed Duke $20 to build a deck and you give LSV $1,000 to build a deck, that LSV would win every time. They're both fantastic professional players, but it is very unlikely that Reed Duke would be able to overcome the pay to win advantage that LSV would have. I'm not going to sit here and argue over who's better and who's worse, but if one of them is limited to $20 and the other isn't, then chances are the one with the limit will lose pretty much every game ever because, the pay to win advantage is just too strong. So look, I know it's tough to hear. People don't want their favorite game to be associated with such a negative term. So let me say one more thing before finishing this video. I think people have a tendency to sort of have their reality warped by the people they play against, right? Let's say you walk into a room, let's say it's a competitive, tournament of some video game, and let's say that for some reason they have pay to win options turned on, which they never should, by the way, but any competent, good tournament game will not have pay to win options on in a tournament. Magic the Gathering does, but whatever. But let's say you walk into that room, there are 100 people there, and of the 100, only 5 of them have the pay to win advantages. Those people will be very dominant, right? Like when you have 95 people who are on free to play accounts and you have 5 serious competitive players with pay to win accounts, then it's like, wow, they're like really just gonna win everything, right? Obviously. But with Magic, you walk into a tournament hall and like 95% of the people have bought in. So that kind of gives us this weird warped reality where we kind of forget that just because every single person who's competing against us at a GP has paid, we forget that not everyone at the Friday Night Magic level has, not everyone at the kitchen table level has. And while that might not affect you, right? Like, you might be just a tournament grinder and not really give a shit, and it makes sense, right? Like, who cares? But that's the problem, right? It's like we forget that just because we're playing competitively against competitive only players, we forget that not everyone can afford that. And I get that from the competitive level, like if you are Reed Duke, it gets really frustrating when you see casual players saying that you don't deserve, you know, what you've achieved, that you're just pay to win. And that's just as garbage as the people who deny that the game is pay to win, right? Because it's not true. It's not true. If you're watching this and you're a casual player, do not criticize professional players, because at that level, the pay to win advantage doesn't matter. It's nullified. So those people are winning because they're good players. So please respect competitive players. They deserve respect. They're amazing people. But on the flip side, you have the competitive players who deny that the game is pay to win, and they like kind of live in their own little world where they just pretend that it doesn't exist. And it kind of sucks for the people who can't afford to play the game. You know, like you go to a Friday Night Magic and you see people come in with casual decks because they can't afford to spend $1,000 on a deck, and they get crushed and then they never show up again. So you just have these people come in, get crushed, leave. A couple more people come in, they get crushed, they leave. And meanwhile, the competitive players are like, yeah, game's not pay to win. I don't know what you're talking about. And it sucks, because if we could come to terms with it, if we could just say, yep, it's pay to win, then maybe we could be a little bit more sympathetic towards people who, you know, just can't afford to pay. It sucks to say it. I get it. I know it's tough to hear. People don't want to hear their favorite game being associated with such a negative term. But look, paying a lot of money for powerful cards does give you an advantage over people who can't or don't pay for those cards. Pretending that it doesn't exist doesn't make it any less true. And I'm definitely not agreeing with the casual players who say that, you know, that the competitive players don't deserve recognition for their talents, because that's also pretty lame. It doesn't mean that Magic isn't skill-based. It doesn't mean that competitive players aren't amazingly talented people, and it doesn't undermine your accomplishment when you expertly navigate a complicated board state to take down a worthy opponent. But it's there. It's true. And then maybe if we could just, you know, come to terms with that, then maybe we could make strides towards making it better. Maybe we could be a little bit more understanding when people complain that they can't afford, you know, a tier 1 deck because, you know, it's very expensive. And I feel like we just forget. We forget what it's like when we were unable to afford a deck. And we're talking about pieces of cardboard here. So, you know, it's annoying. I think we would be better off if we could just, you know, admit that it is pay to win, and maybe be angry about it, or at least, you know, be socially conscious of it instead of living in denial and living with our heads in the sand. Let's just admit it. It's true. And if we can just admit it, then maybe we can improve upon it. That's all I have to say, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.